Good afternoon, everybody. Warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking the time to connect with us today. Through these webinars, we're trying to bring the clients, communities and our colleagues together. This webinar is focusing on the increased risk of fraud during coronavirus and what businesses can do in relation to those risks. I am the host, Emma Windle, and I'm in the regulatory team at Irwin Mitchell. I'm also joined by my colleague, Craig Weston, who's also in the regulatory team at Irwin Mitchell. And we're also very happy to be joined by Jim G, who's partner and head of forensic services at Crowe. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters. Thank you to those who have already submitted questions. We will deal with those at the end. You can submit additional questions throughout the session via the question and answer function on your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the session as well. If when submitting the questions you can include your name and email address, then that would be very helpful in case we don't get a chance to respond to your question, then we can deal with it after the session. We are recording this event and the recording will be sent out afterwards. And towards the end of the session, we will send out a feedback link. So we'll be very grateful if you could just spend a few minutes letting us know your feedback. So let's get started. I'll now hand over to Jim, who's going to do the first presentation.
Thank you, Emma. And I'm very pleased to be here today to present to you, alongside my colleagues at Irwin Mitchell, about fraud and particularly the impact of the COVID recession on fraud. We have seen a real surge in fraud, and there are some urgent things that you need to be doing now. Fraud has always been a pernicious problem, and its economic effects have been clear. Private companies are less financially healthy and stable. The quality of public services is reduced. Individual citizens have less disposable income, and indeed charities are deprived of resources needed for charitable purposes. So in every sector of every country, fraud has a serious and detrimental impact on the quality of life. And rapid changes have taken place in countering fraud over the last 15 to 20 years. It used to be thought that the only thing to be done was to hope that it wouldn't happen, and then to react when it did, after losses had been incurred, with an investigation followed sometimes by litigation or prosecution. Well, that's still very important, but in 2020, we can do a lot more. We can seek to change the balance of human behaviour by strengthening anti-fraud cultures and deterrent effects. We can design the weaknesses out of processes and systems, which provide the opportunities for fraud, but core to effective protection is still access to the right forensic and legal professional skills to properly investigate what's happened, and then if fraud is believed to have taken place, to seek to apply the combination of sanctions and recover losses. What I will do today is to describe the surge of fraud that's currently taking place and explain what practical steps organisations can take to protect themselves against it. Next slide, please. I've been a counter-fraud specialist now for more than 25 years, as well as my role at Crowe. I'm a visiting professor. I chair Europe's premier research institute, the Centre for Forensic Counter-Fraud and Cybercrime Studies at University of Portsmouth. And you can probably tell I've worked in this area for more than 25 years because my hair is grey and there isn't much of it left, and it's kind of what working in this area does to you. I used to be, before joining private practice, Chief Executive of the NHS Counter-Fraud Service, protecting the second largest organisation in the world, an advisor to the UK Attorney General. And since joining private practice, I've advised governments, companies and charities in 43 different countries to date. But a starting point for my presentation probably should be what was the position prior to COVID. And at that time, over 7% of expenditure was already being lost to fraud and error. But we now have a big increase as criminals try to exploit the current health and economic emergency. And there's really two aspects to that. There's the COVID-19 specific fraud, which is more of a recent fashion. Previously have been different other fashions, if you can call it that, of types of specific fraud. And then there's an increase in more general fraud, really resulting from the financial pressures originating in the economic crisis. Next slide, please. So some of the examples of COVID-19 fraud, we've had fraudsters pretending to be undertaking research for the World Health Organization, fraudsters seeking donations for supplies for the NHS. We've had scams relating to supposed fines on people for leaving home more than once. We've had fraudsters providing articles, taking people to websites where supposedly they'll learn about the progress of the virus, and then the websites have been harvesting personal details. We even had investment and trading advice on people how to short different stocks and to take advantage of the coronavirus downturn. And of course, people purporting to come from HMRC offering tax refunds and other things as well. So those are the COVID specific frauds that we've seen. Next slide, please. But in a way, I'm more interested, and I think it's even more pernicious and worrying, and that's the economic crisis driven fraud. And we've seen examples there of employees who've either been made redundant already or who think they're going to be, actually stealing client data and intellectual property and looking to provide that almost as a bonus for a prospective new employer. We've seen fraudulent invoices submitted by under pressure, excuse me, under pressure suppliers for goods and services that have either never been delivered or were never ordered in the first place. We've seen senior managers and directors under financial pressure, often with their colleagues in a particular company not aware of that, doing things to manipulate accounts and siphon off money. One of those examples was a gambling habit somebody had had for many years, to the extent he was even asking for advanced imprests of money in order to be able to pay cash, supposedly for railway tickets. Also, another senior manager of another company who, unbeknown to his colleagues, was literally living from month to month. And of course, financial pressure associated with COVID perhaps led him to do something he wouldn't normally have contemplated in normal times. We've also seen attempted, sadly successful, changes in bank account details to misdirect money. That's called mandate fraud. And we're starting to see the creation of Phoenix companies, which are really designed to siphon off the assets of companies receiving government grants, loans, furlough payments, deferred tax, and then to close those companies once that's occurred. And those kind of economic crisis driven fraud, I think that's what will really drive up the prevalence of fraud. And I'd just emphasize those risks are internal and external. When I talk about fraud, it's both. Next slide, please. So what's the scale of the problem? Well, Crowe and the University of Portsmouth together manage the largest database in the world about the nature and extent of fraud. That's got 21 years of data about the measured cost of fraud from 40 sectors, different countries, and the data actually is across over 19 trillion, and I did say trillion, sterling of expenditure. We'd already seen prior to COVID an increase of 56% from average cost of fraud in terms of expenditure being 4.6% in 2007, up to over 7% by 2018. But the latest research that the team that I chair at Portsmouth have undertaken, they actually looked back at the last 3 UK recessions over the last 40 years. So the 1980 recession, the 1990 recession, and the 2008-9 recession. And they looked at the government statistics for shrinkage in gross domestic product, and then the increase in the rate of fraud. For some time, people have been aware in general terms that when a recession happened, the level of fraud increased. But this is the first research to try and pin down by how much. And across those 3 major recessions over 40 years, on average, for every 1% shrinkage in GDP, you get a 4% increase in fraud. Next slide, please. So the Office for National Statistics, I think 3 weeks ago, actually revealed in the period up to the end of June, the economy had shrunk by 25% in those 3 months. And based upon what's happened in previous recessions, that means that we should expect fraud to increase by 100%. And what that means, I'm sure most organisations will have some type of protection in place, often referred to as controls, but then you need to remember that fraud is a continuously evolving risk. So unless the controls are evolving as fast, then they're likely not going to be totally effective. But it's unlikely that previous arrangements will be effective against unprecedented levels of fraud unless those arrangements are reviewed and strengthened. Next slide, please. So in my view, there's 7 things that organisations need to do. And the first 2 are really about changing the balance of human behaviour. So there is always an honest majority in any organisation, but sadly there is also always a dishonest minority. If you can grow and mobilise the honest majority and deter and shrink the dishonest minority by changing the balance of human behaviour, then you can reduce the extent of fraud that will impact your organisation. So the first 2 things: communicate messages to that honest majority internally and externally that they need to increase their vigilance. Secondly, communicate messages to the dishonest minority that that extra vigilance is in place, the organisation is determined to protect itself and will deal severely with any examples of fraud. The third thing organisations need to consider is actually thinking about where the high internal and external risks lie. So maybe looking especially intensely at small suppliers who might be under greater financial pressure. Maybe looking at some of the senior executives within the organisation to try and determine if they are under financial pressure which they haven't acknowledged. The fourth thing you need to consider is using some of the advanced data science techniques to identify anomalous behaviour. Something can be anomalous without being fraud. We need to be clear about that. But you want to detect anomalous behaviour, anomalous payments, things like that. And a lot of people use the phrase data analytics. Well, actually data analytics has been around for about 25 years. So I'm talking about something a bit more advanced about that. Data visualization, 3D data analysis, things like that. So those are things to prevent and detect. But then, of course, extremely unlikely, and that's what the data shows, that an organisation will manage to prevent any fraud taking place. The question isn't really whether fraud is taking place or not, but the extent to which it's taking place. That's what the data shows. So you need to make sure you have access to a remote capacity, remote because of the current circumstances in terms of office working and remote working and social distancing, a remote capacity to investigate what has happened if suspicion has arisen, and to trace assets. You also need to make sure, and again, this is because of the very rapidly evolving nature of fraud, it really is probably more akin to a medical virus than to other risks, continually evolving and mutating and changing. And indeed, we've even seen it change since the start of the COVID crisis. So you need to make sure you're aware of the latest intelligence about the latest ways in which fraud is being undertaken. And finally, and crucially, if you do suspect that fraud has taken place, for goodness sake, make sure you have access to the right professional legal advice about criminal, civil, disciplinary and regulatory sanctions and how to recover losses. Next slide, please. So I've tried to outline what the current position is. Crowe has a large team of forensic specialists who already have the capacity to undertake legally compliant remote investigations, discreetly taking remote forensic images of computers in particular. That's something which is important, and also remotely interviewing witnesses and suspects in a legally compliant manner. Maybe that you don't need that immediately, but quite important to actually have access to that kind of capacity as quickly as possible if a suspicion arises. Also, it's important to have an independent assessment of how well protected you are or not. Often there will be somebody in your organisation who has the responsibility for doing that. If you ask them, are we well protected? It's quite unlikely that they will say no. So important to get an independent assessment in that respect. And finally, we need to make sure that we understand what the situation is. At this very moment, there will be some people out there contemplating how they can dishonestly thrive at our expense. There will also be those under financial pressure planning to maintain their wealth by dishonest means. What I would hope, partly as a result of some of the advice in this webinar, is that organisations will recognise the need to protect themselves properly. Our crisis, our COVID health and economic crisis, must not be allowed to become the fraudster's opportunity. Next slide, please. So thank you for that. Very happy to take any questions after the whole of the webinar and presentations have been completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm just going to do a short session now, focusing more on the COVID-related fraud aspects that Jim has referenced. As Jim set out, COVID-19 related fraud is potentially a huge problem for businesses, and awareness is really key. Fraudsters and cyber criminals are constantly adapting their approaches and seeking to try to take advantage of the uncertainties and the changes that are still taking place even now on a daily basis in relation to COVID and the government's response. Jim provided in his presentation a number of specific examples of frauds and cybercrime attempts which have arisen as a result of the unique set of circumstances created by the pandemic, most of which are phishing or smishing or whaling type techniques, which is essentially where fraudsters and cyber criminals are trying to obtain sensitive and confidential information through a variety of different mediums, whether it be email or social media or website links, and where an employee within your organisation is a victim of such an approach, this can leave the organisation wide open to fraudulent activities and data breaches and consequential huge reputational damage. Often the aim is not necessarily to steal money directly from the company, but to obtain a much more valuable resource of data and use blackmail techniques to try and get money for the safe return of that data. Whaling, which is not necessarily as familiar to some people as phishing and smishing, is specifically targeted at senior executive level and is usually an approach from an alleged trusted supplier requesting a transfer of funds. And we've also got examples such as invoice fraud and business email compromise fraud, which are relatively simplistic ways of rerouting funds from a legitimate source ultimately into a fraudster's bank account. And as Jim has set out in terms of the research, there has been a huge increase in these types of fraud during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So why have these increased during COVID-19? There's been a move very quickly in a lot of organisations to remote working, and the systems and procedures in place therefore may not be as secure as they used to be. The business has less control over the security of those systems being used at home, and that obviously leaves potential gaps in terms of the security and access for fraudsters and cyber criminals to get access. There's also been a period of rapid and huge change in terms of new policies and procedures and guidance being issued often daily, and that makes what would otherwise be an unusual request perhaps less unusual, because the rapid changes in businesses have essentially meant that ordinary requests, out of the ordinary requests, are no longer out of the ordinary. That will make it less easy for individuals within your organisation to spot the fraudulent ones. Individuals during the pandemic are also feeling uncertain, fearful and vulnerable, and that can sometimes lead to less vigilance in relation to these kind of areas. And there's the obvious increase in distractions potentially in a home working environment. And all of these have resulted in an increased opportunity for fraudsters, and they have seized these opportunities in great sways. Next slide, please. So what can businesses do about these specific types of risks? I think the first thing to understand is what the risks are and how the risks faced may have changed in light of the changes to your business brought about by COVID-19. You can't even begin to deal with them unless you fully understand what they are. There is therefore an immediate need to undertake a fraud and cybercrime risk assessment, which needs, unfortunately, at the moment to be continuously reviewed for any changes within the business operations. For example, as the phased return to work premises takes place over the next few weeks and months, it's likely that some risk areas will decrease and some will increase. And it's really important that that assessment is kept updated and that you maintain a record of it for future purposes. It's also important, as Jim referenced, that you get independent expert advice in relation to these key areas of risk. It's important that you get a full objective analysis of what your risks are, and getting your IT team, for example, to audit their own systems and procedures is unlikely to provide a truly objective analysis. Information is power. I know, for example, Jim's team at Crowe are able to do searches on the dark web to find out what information is out there in relation to your organisation, and to find out how much your business email addresses are for sale for example, or whether there are dark web discussions going on in relation to your organisation. That is a unique insight, and finding out what's out there will hopefully assist in finding for the organisation to find out where those gaps are and how they can fill those gaps in the future. It's important to ensure that your security systems are updated and reviewed regularly. It may be that as a result of the new COVID secure health and safety requirements, these identify and raise new risk areas. For example, if doors need to be left open for COVID secure reasons, then there's potentially more risks from a security point of view. Similarly, if there are less physical security checks going on within an organisation, that may impact on what risks are available from a cybercrime point of view. It's important that your finance systems have multiple layers of authorisation, and whilst this might add an additional administrative burden, whilst ever the business is operating in an unusual way, these checks and balances will provide that additional layer of protection, which is essential when things are so uncertain and changing regularly. And it's really important that employees are aware of the risk and are clear as to the procedures that they need to follow, and that you provide training in relation to any new risks that have been identified. Test those employees out, send phishing emails to see how your organisation responds, and this will enable you to identify further training needs. And make sure that these risk areas are identified and discussed regularly and openly in team meetings. It should be an agenda item so that people can learn from other experiences that people have had. And it should be really easy for employees to report any emails or incidents that they have received, and that feedback is given where those incidents have been identified, and recognition given where a risk has been properly identified. Next slide, please. I thought Furlough Fraud probably deserved a slot of its own. I suspect 6 months ago, no one even knew the word furlough, and yet now it's probably one of the most commonly used phrases in the media. And furlough fraud is a specific area which has clearly arisen as a result directly of the COVID pandemic and the measures introduced by the government. Furlough fraud in itself isn't an offence per se. What it's specifically referring to is the obtaining of the coronavirus job retention scheme funds, essentially through a breach of the rules that were brought in. This could essentially be considered a fraud offence under the Fraud Act, and may also constitute tax evasion. So there are a number of ways in which furlough fraud can be ultimately tackled by the authorities in due course. I think it deserves a mention specifically because it's clear HMRC are ramping up their activity in this regard. There has been one arrest so far in relation to furlough fraud, along with other offences, but it is anticipated that their activities in this area will increase over the next few months. This has been particularly spurred on by a high number of whistleblowing reports, which have been provided and can be provided on an anonymous basis, and will give HMRC a wealth of information for them to start their investigations in due course. I also suspect that given the scale of the funds that have been accessed through the scheme, which from all sources appears to be significantly in excess of what the government thought they were going to be spending, it's likely that HMRC have been given a very clear mandate to recoup any improperly claimed funds wherever possible. For any one of the people on the webinar who have tried to engage with the furlough scheme, no doubt you will have encountered uncertainty, inadequate guidance, changing guidance, and a general feeling of frustration, particularly in the initial days when the scheme was first introduced. The rules were introduced quickly, and whilst it is clear that there are some businesses out there who knowingly and deliberately flouted the rules, of more concern here are those that may have broken them innocently or mistakenly and unintentionally. The main issues are likely to surround the complexity of some of the rules, but particularly the requirement that there can be no work undertaken when on furlough. And for example, where you have an employer who, with the best of intentions, included a furloughed worker on a team update call, potentially this could technically be in breach of the rules. HMRC have said they will be lenient to genuine mistakes. However, anyone who has encountered HMRC previously will know that their version of leniency and your version of leniency may not necessarily match. And the process of engagement with HMRC can be a long, difficult, costly and frustrating one. When it has been done innocently, then HMRC will still seek to recover funds unlawfully claimed, which could result in significant financial difficulties at an already difficult economic time. The Finance Act, which is recently brought in, deems the funds received via the job retention scheme as a tax liability. So that enables HMRC to treat it as such and investigate it with the same powers that they have for other tax related offences. However, significantly, what the Finance Act did introduce is an amnesty, which is a period of essentially 90 days, which I think takes it up to around 20th of October, for self-reporting mistakes made or fraudulent claims. So it covers both aspects. And if a self-report is made, then the only sanction is repayment of the funds, as opposed to the significant additional penalties that can be imposed if there is an investigation, which can be up to 30 to 100% of the amount that's been claimed. So the message now, I think, really in relation to furlough fraud is that there needs to be an urgent review to make sure that the procedures that were followed were done properly, and where any mistakes were made, then urgent advice should be sought as to whether you can consider the amnesty that's available. It won't be available. I don't imagine it would be extended. Once that 90 days is up, HMRC will, I'm sure, begin to investigate with a new vigour. Next slide, please. Craig, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Craig Weston. I'm a Senior Associate in the Regulatory Investigations team at Irwin Mitchell, and I'm going to talk to you today about something slightly different. I'm going to look at the corporate, criminal and regulatory liability that could arise from the increased risks of those sorts of offences being committed because of the circumstances around COVID-19. Now, I can hear you all saying, well, we're having to deal with COVID-19. Why should we have to deal with that as well? So I thought it would be interesting with my first slide to look at some of the drivers for why businesses should be considering that corporate criminal liability position at this stage. And I've grouped it into three areas why. It provides an opportunity. You will have to act to ensure that you are meeting your legal responsibilities, but also in acting you mitigate the risk of succumbing to one of those offences and the financial and reputational risk that can flow from it. In addition, you are going to avoid the cost of fraud to the business, those investigation costs, the financial loss and reputational damage. And for those of you who work in businesses who are regulated by a professional regulator, you will mitigate the risk of any regulatory or disciplinary action and sanctions. But more interestingly for me, COVID-19 presents a real opportunity for businesses to real world assess the robustness of current processes and procedures, and also provides a narrative where you have struggled to get board level engagement with corporate criminal liability issues to force that issue at board level and get that engagement and the resources that may have not been forthcoming before. Next slide, please. So what increased risks do businesses face? Well, some of those have been highlighted by Emma and Jim already. And if they haven't scared you into action, I'm going to try to scare you into action. You will see from this slide that COVID-19 and the economic downturn presents an increased risk of your own employee base and those who act on your behalf, such as subcontractors and agents, being more susceptible to agreeing to pay or receive bribes primarily as a result of the scarcity of work that is around, and also the margins in work being squeezed. But in times where people still want to achieve bonuses because they're struggling financially and still have targets to meet, that presents an increased risk, in my professional view, of companies falling foul of or suffering bribery and corruption in their organisation, and exposing them to a risk of failing to prevent bribery offences under the UK Bribery Act. Similar to that, we have a situation where employees, contractors and suppliers are more likely to be willing to undertake tax fraud. For example, suppliers persuading employees within your organisation to invoice without VAT, or with VAT when they are not VAT registered, so that they are paid more than they should be paid. We also are experiencing an unprecedented time where there is an increase in expenses fraud, and that comes about as a result of the remoteness of the supervision of those processes and procedures. We're all working at home, we're not physically in the office, and one can see a situation where there is less scrutiny over those expenses that are being submitted. Emma has spoken about misdirection and invoicing fraud, but also we are seeing an increase in inquiries around money laundering. For those of you who are in the regulated sector for money laundering, we are seeing an increase in the instances of new inquiries resulting in jobs being open, payments on account being made, and then then the client saying that they no longer want to work with that organisation and requesting the money back, thereby washing the money through a legitimate source. Next slide, please. So in light of the increased risk of those corporate criminal liability offences being committed, or at least exposing businesses to them, what should businesses be doing? Well, it's inescapable that COVID-19 has changed the landscape within which we all work and operate our businesses. And therefore, the first question I pose to you is, can you take comfort today that the policies and procedures that you have in place to fight corporate crime within your organisations remain fit for purpose? If you think of the current climate now, it's very different from 6 months ago. So there are a number of steps that I would urge businesses to take, and that's why I say it presents an opportunity to assess the robustness of your current processes and procedures. And the first step is a detailed process and policy review, undertaking detailed and updated risk assessments in light of COVID-19, documenting those risk assessments for the purposes of an audit trail, and taking the necessary remedial action in light of any increased risks that have been noted or observed. Specifically in relation to the UK Bribery Act and the facilitation of tax evasion offences under the Criminal Finances Act, you will want to assess whether the adequate procedures that your company has put in place to mitigate companies' exposure to those offences remain adequate in light of COVID-19. You will want to review your invoicing procedures and whether they are fit for purpose from a remote perspective. So, for example, your procedures may have previously involved a 4 eyes procedure. An invoice comes into the procurement department or the finance department, it's seen by one employee, and then it's checked by another employee, therefore 4 eyes being applied to it. Does that still work in the current COVID-19 climate where we're all working at home, or is there a better technological solution for reviewing and authorising those invoices? Jim picked up on my next point, which was the review of the designation of authority limits on contract award or spend, where we are seeing the possibility of senior execs abusing their designation of authority and entering into contracts or awarding contracts beyond their dane of authority, or in certain circumstances awarding contracts that have no commerciality or materiality involved in them at all. You will also want to review your contract negotiation and agreement processes in light of home working and the changes to the supervision around that. Also your BD and gifts register and policies, particularly on spend limits. And You will also want to review your contract wording to include UK Bribery Act facilitation of tax evasion provisions and clauses. You will also potentially want to review your payment processes because of the increased risk of misdirection fraud. You'll want to have measures in place to pick up those instances. And you may, in light of COVID-19 and the increased risks that have been identified and the potential impact on your business of suffering a cyber attack or a COVID-related fraud, have in place and create a dawn raid or rapid response policy as to how your business would respond were anything of that nature to be detected. Next slide, please. Alongside that policy and process review, it's imperative that your employee base receives updated and refreshed training, particularly on anti-money laundering, AML, the UK Bribery Act, UKBA, the facilitation of tax evasion, invoicing and payment processes, gifts and hospitality policy, and expenses policy. Now is a really opportune moment to do that. It's often difficult to get 30, 40 people in a room, in an office where you've got a disparate workforce all across the country. We are now seeing that most companies have a technological solution to meetings, and it's a real opportunity to provide that refresh training when you've got a captive audience and a technological solution to deliver that training. Alongside that training, you will need to think about communication to your employees, communicating to them about the increased risks and need for vigilance. So, for example, were you to engage Crowe to do a risk analysis of your business and they identified particular concerns or particular areas where they were vulnerable, you'd want to communicate those in a sensitive way to your employee base to ensure that those employees are vigilant. But also you want to communicate the steps that are being taken by the company to ensure robustness and a robust response to COVID-19 related fraud risks, to ensure that those who are dishonestly minded are deterred from acting in such a way. If I could ask for the next slide, please. And finally, from a opportunity perspective, I mentioned that sometimes you struggle with corporate criminal liability and regulatory liability risks to get the resource you needed at board level. And in my opinion, COVID-19 presents a real opportunity to get that resource you may feel you need in your business. So I would bear in mind the COVID landscape, as this may need to be remote resource acquisition, like Jim has already talked about, remote investigation capabilities or remote due diligence capabilities for supply chains. It's likely to need to be tech-led, whereas it may have been person-led before, particularly in the invoicing, expenses, contract negotiation and training spaces. You may also want to consider appointing an internal COVID-19 fraud champion or task force, who on a periodic basis reviews both the risks that are identified, the changes in those risks, and then the company's response. And my recommendation would be that you identify and engage a rapid response team of external advisors, as Jim has suggested, made up of forensic accountants, horizon scanning capabilities, a good law firm with good investigation capabilities and a track record with dealing with the regulators such as the Serious Fraud Office or the FCA. And you may also want to consider a decent PR agency, because the reputational damage can be significant even if the regulatory and criminal sanctions don't flow. Next slide, please. So the reason that I've suggested that you take those steps is because the increased risk from COVID-19 could lead to prosecutions and fines for your company were any bribery and corruption or facilitation of tax evasion offence uncovered. And if you do have suspicion that anything has been uncovered, my advice is to seek advice as to how to structure any internal investigation immediately. Do not trample yourself over the proverbial crime scene, as you risk making it potentially worse. Keep the matter confidential. Keep an action log which records your decision making. It's essential that you create a small response team. You want this to be dealt with in a sensitive way and not the talk of the office. Lock down employee access to files and data. Implement a non-destruction policy around data, both physical and electronic. Seek advice, and this is really important, on any reporting obligations you may have to a regulator, whether that be the Information Commissioner, the Serious Fraud Office, or the FCA, or professional regulators such as the ACCA or the ICAEW. And also ensure that you have board level engagement and a reporting line into the board, because ultimately they are the ones that are going to have to sign off on any decision making around how things are investigated and or reported. Hopefully you found that an interesting insight into my thoughts on the increased risks as a result of COVID-19 into corporate criminal liability. I'll hand back to Emma.
Thank you. We had received a question in advance of the webinar, which is, what is the external auditor's responsibility for fraud? Is part of their job to be aware of it? And I think Jim's in a position to give some insight into that.
Yes, the current position is outlined by International Standard on Auditing 240. And essentially what that means is that auditors don't currently have a responsibility to detect fraud, but they do have a responsibility to assess their client organisation's capacity to protect themselves against fraud, including detecting fraud. So that's the way the position is at present, although there are all sorts of discussions taking place as a result of some recent, perhaps I can put this in inverted commas, failures of auditors in respect of high profile fraud. There are all sorts of discussions taking place as to whether the responsibilities of auditors should be deepened in this respect, or at least the responsibilities in relation to an audit, whatever skills, be they of auditors or others, are deployed within the context of that audit. So that's the current position.
The only other thing I would add on to what Jim has observed in relation to auditors' responsibilities is the fact that you do use an auditor and rely on a third party in the context of auditing your processes and procedures is not a panacea. It's not a sticking plaster for a company, and it doesn't absolve you of your own liability and responsibility. It forms part of what might be your first or second line defence, but it doesn't form part of it doesn't provide you with a complete defence.
Thank you both. We haven't received any other further questions. I just wanted Jim to elaborate a little bit more perhaps on the dark web offering that I referenced earlier, because it's really quite interesting and I think a little bit different, and in terms of an option to find out more information about your business and its risk areas.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Yes, we have a capacity. For those that are not aware, that the dark web is the part of the hidden web, which itself represents 49/50ths of the data that is out there. We only search with our traditional search engines about 1/50th of the data that's on the web. But the dark web is the part of the hidden web that's been best known historically for individuals seeking to buy sex, drugs, or guns. However, increasingly in recent years, it's been used as the place where covert discussions can take place about organising fraud and cybercrime. And we've developed in recent years a capacity to search the dark web for discussions about fraud and cybercrime being planned against particular organisations. It's a highly cost-effective service. Indeed, we did some research which we published in 2018, where we took the top 50 UK brands and we found active discussions taking place in respect of 21 of those 50 brands about how to attack them and also how to monetize those attacks. But it's not just discussions we can look for. We have managed to acquire a capacity to search for compromised emails and passwords on the forums from which they are sold. The average price of a compromised email and password is just $2. So you can imagine the balance between supply and demand. There's an awful lot of supply out there. We do those searches again for our clients in relation to their domains, and I have yet to do such a search without significant numbers of compromised emails and passwords being out there. Indeed, a traditional method of cybercrime is phishing somebody's email, but you don't necessarily need to do that. You can potentially go and buy their email address and related password on the dark web. So both are quite important capacities if you want to know your exposure in the main place where fraud and cybercrime is planned, which is the dark web.
Thank you, Jim. Well, we haven't received any more questions through, so I think that brings an end to the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. If you do have any further questions or anything else crops up, our contact details are on the screen there, and you can go to irwinmitchell.com to find further legal updates and further webinars that are due around in the next few weeks. And please provide feedback via the link if you spare a few minutes. Thank you very much.